Talk tonight about Saint Therese de Lisieux. You guys have your workbooks. It's on page 92 and 93. There's 2-page write-up on her in there. You're welcome to look at that. There's a lot of info on there. I'm going to try and hit the highlights of her life. And she's an interesting saint because she's one that if she had not been asked to write her story down, we probably never would have heard about her. And yet she's become one of the, literally, some people say one of the greatest saints in the church. Certainly, Pope Pius X said she possibly could be one of the greatest saints of the 20th century. And he said that at the beginning of the 20th century. He said that in 1910. The thing about Saint Therese is that she didn't really do anything spectacular. In fact, that was kind of her claim to fame, is that she did everything so simply that, and we'll learn about what she called the little way. She only called it that like twice when she wrote it down, right? But that's what it's become known as, is the little way. Her simplistic way of doing things has kind of earned her a place. Like she figured out a new path to holiness that some people had kind of done, but she kind of articulated it and demonstrated it well. And she had a great influence on a lot of people after that. So she was born, she lived at the end of the 19th century. She was born in 1873. She was born on January 2nd, 1873, which, as I was doing the research on this, I realized is exactly 125 years before my daughter was born. She was born on January 2nd, 1998. So I thought that was curious. But anyway, just from a personal standpoint, she was the youngest of 9 kids. She had, her parents had both investigated going to religious life, but both of them were turned down for one reason or another. Her father, Louis, did not know Latin, and so they wouldn't let him into this friary. Her mother, they just never really gave her a reason, but they said, no, we feel this is not your calling. After that, she started a lace-making business when she was 22, and her father, and then Louis, Therese's father, Louis, was a jeweler and a watchmaker. So they both had pretty good jobs. In fact, Zelly's lace-making business was so profitable that Louis sold his watchmaking business because hers was more profitable. And so they had a reasonable amount of money. You know, they were fairly well off. They weren't like super, super rich, but they didn't have anything that they were lacking either. They had a couple of servants that helped them out in the house. But Louis and Zelly got married, and they decided right off the bat, because they both wanted to live this very chaste life, that they both decided they were going to live as brother and sister for their marriage, and which meant that they weren't going to have relations, and they didn't plan on having any kids. They both had a spiritual director, and I don't know if it's the same guy, but he said, no, that's not how marriage works. You guys need to have relations and have children. So they started having kids. They had 9 kids. 5 of them survived. 4 of them along the way, I think it was 4, 5, 6, and 8. Those children died anywhere from the age of like 4 or 5 months to like one of them died at 5 years old. But the ones that all survived were all girls. And it was Marie and Pauline were the 2 oldest, and then Therese was the youngest one. And there was about 18 years difference between the oldest and the youngest. So anyway, they lived a fairly comfortable lifestyle. There was one day when Therese was 4, and so Therese wrote down all of her autobiography in this book right here under when she was in the monastery, or in the convent, I should say. And so we learn about an incident that happened when she was 4 years old, where she was out picking flowers one day when they were on a picnic, and she picked a bouquet for her mother, and she said, "Oh, Mother, I wish you would die." And her mother said, or both her mother, "Why would you say such a thing?" And she said, "Because the only way you can go to heaven is to die, and I want you to go to heaven." So as a 4-year-old, it's not like she wanted her mother to die. She just wanted her to go to heaven, but that was in the mind of a 4-year-old. That's kind of how she rationalized it. Well, it's curious because even at that time, they think that Zelly knew that she was terminally ill. She had breast cancer, and she died just a few months after that. And so at that moment in time, Therese's life changed dramatically. And having lived through that myself, where I told you guys my wife died when she was when my kids were 9 and 12, but she was diagnosed when my kids were 5 and 8. it changes the dynamic of the family a lot. And it in a way, at least in ours, and obviously in the Martin family, here it strengthened the relationships. It changed the dynamics, but it strengthened. So the sisters were incredibly close, and they all took care of one another. And the older ones took care of the younger ones, to the point where after Zélie died, one of the Celine said that she wanted Marie to be her new mother, and Therese said, "I want Pauline to be my new mother." And so those older sisters took on that mothering role, even as much as schooling them at home and doing all these other things, but really cared for them and tucked them in at night and all this type of thing. But Therese wrote that when her mother died, she changed in a big way, as you would expect. And this is what she wrote. She said, "All my happiness and gaiety went after mother died. I had been so lively and open, and now I became diffident and oversensitive, crying if anyone even looked at me. I wanted to be left alone and hated meeting strangers. It was only in the intimacy of my own family where everyone was wonderfully kind and I could be more myself." And so she became very introverted, out in public, but at home she was, felt very comfortable, and there was a lot of openness amongst all the family. And her father and her had a very special relationship, and he called her my little queen, and she called him my king. And so they did this kind of use this as how they referred to each other. So Therese really struggled with, just kind of temper tantrums and just crying at the drop of a hat and things like that. But, at first glance, people thought, oh, she's just a spoiled brat. But it's, she missed her mom, right? She lost her mom when she was 4.5. That's a big deal. And so they were going to a Catholic school where the nuns taught, and she was very studious, and she just kind of understood things as she learned them, and so she always seemed to have the answer. And so the nuns would call on her when she'd raise her hand, and she would give the answer. And this really irked some of the other students, so much so that they picked on her and bullied her, and to the point where life at school became unbearable to her. And so she asked Pauline, and Pauline and her went to her father and said, "Can Pauline school me at home?" And her father, at first kind of was resistant, but he said, "Yeah, okay, we'll do it as a trial and see how it goes. Just make sure that you're learning." And she did. She excelled at that, and so he let that go on. And she was much happier then, because people out in the world just seemed to kind of, she just sort of attracted the people that would be mean to her, it seemed like. So she when she was about 7 or 8 years old, this happened, and so for the next year or two, Pauline was her primary teacher. Pauline was about 12 years older than her, so by the time she was about 8, 9 years old, Pauline's going to be 20, 21, and Pauline knew that she was called to go to the convent. There was a convent in town. It was a Carmelite convent, so it was of Mount Carmel. So they said they would be entering Carmel, is how they phrased it. And Pauline didn't know how to tell Therese, but Therese overheard a conversation that Pauline and one of the sisters was having, and found out that way. So it was kind of hurtful to her. But Pauline, finally told her what was going on, and Therese basically said, "Pauline is dead to me." She's basically had felt like she was losing a second mother. And so this was very traumatic for her as well. Pauline goes off to the convent, and shortly thereafter, so this is when Therese is about 9 years old. Shortly after that, Therese starts having these unexplained headaches and kind of these deliriums, where there was one point where she was kind of like in a delirious coma for like 2 weeks. And the doctors couldn't explain it. And Therese recalls in her autobiography that she felt like there was times where she was being tormented by demons or the devil, and like nails on the wall would all of a sudden appear as if they were fingers or hands trying to reach out and get her, and so she felt like there was this spiritual attack going on when she was in this, and that even the whole illness was a spiritual attack. So the doctors couldn't explain it, and they were praying, and they were getting frustrated. They didn't know what to do, and so there was one night when the sisters, they were praying, and they brought this statue of the Blessed Mother into the room where Therese was, and she was in this delirium, and her father was praying, and he was just in tears, and the sisters were in tears because they thought she was going to die. And so they started praying to our Blessed Mother in front of this statue. And so in her delirium, Therese saw this, and she started praying to Mary as well. And she writes this about it. She says, I too turned toward my Heavenly Mother, asking, but with all my heart, for her to take pity on me now. Suddenly the statue came to life, and Mary appeared utterly lovely, with a divine beauty I could not possibly describe. There was a wonderful sweetness and goodness about her face, and her expression was infinitely tender. But what went right to my heart was her smile. Then suddenly all my pain was gone. Silently, 2 big tears trickled down my cheeks, tears of complete and heavenly happiness. Our Lady had come to me. And so she had this miraculous cure. But she tried to keep it a secret as much as possible, but it got out that there was this miraculous cure, and people started kind of, asking her questions about it, which was really troubling to her. So after this point, she started developing a deeper devotion to Mary, because here, she's lost 2 mothers, but now she's kind of adopting Mary as her mother, and so she's developing a deep Marian devotion at this point in time. And but one thing she still struggled with was just these outbursts of emotion and things like that. And so when she was at Christmas in 1886, so it had been when she was 13 years old, almost 14, their tradition was to go to the midnight mass. And they came home from the midnight mass. The tradition was when they would get home, they had put their shoes out by the fireplace, and there would be gifts in when they got home that were brought by the infant Jesus. Some places in France it's Father Christmas, but the really Catholic people say it was the infant Jesus that had brought them gifts. So when they got home, there was no gifts, and she was starting to get upset, and her father said, okay, go upstairs, and there will be gifts when you come downstairs. And as she left, her father was talking to Celine and said, she's getting to be too old for this. Thankfully, this will be the last year we have to do this. And Therese heard that. And so she was really shaking my. So she ran upstairs and she was going to have a tantrum. But suddenly she knelt down in front of the crucifix in the room. And she reports in her autobiography that she got this instant grace where basically she left her childhood at that point. That God gave her this grace to kind of get through it. But it wasn't just to get over this. It was like she almost instantly matured into, from a child to a young woman. And so they noticed this. And so her whole demeanor changed after that. And she started becoming more prayerful, and she was reading things like John of the Cross, which for those of you guys, he's Dark Night of the Soul, right? So she's reading this really deep spirituality kind of stuff, and she was liking that. And John of the Cross was a Carmelite as well, so this was attracting her to the Carmelite tradition. And so she started feeling like she had a calling to the convent as well. And part of it was that she wanted to be with her older sisters, but she was realizing that this was her calling, not just to be with her sisters, but that Jesus was calling her to do this. Well, the earliest that you could join was 16. Most of them didn't go till they were like 18 or 19, but 16 was like the bare minimum. And she was 14. Right, and she was just about to turn 15, and so by the time that they petitioned the priest who was in charge of the convent, he said, "No way." He says, "You have to be at least 16, and we don't have room for little girls here, and all this kind of stuff," because the life of these nuns was not an easy life. Right, there was a lot of penances. They ate 1 meal a day. They did a lot of work. Right, they did a lot of prayer, and it's just not for a 14 or 15-year-old was what they said. But Therese, insisted, and her father took her to the bishop, and they talked to the bishop, and the bishop said, "Well, if it's meant to happen, it'll be, but I'll speak more with the person in charge of the convent." And Therese is like, "Oh, that means it's never going to happen." And the bishop says, "Just be patient." So later that year, in November of 1887, they made a pilgrimage to Rome because it was the 50th Jubilee of Pope Leo XIII's priesthood, and so their parish took a pilgrimage to Rome. And so they wound up having a lot of people get an audience with the Holy Father, which meant that one by one they could go up and they could kneel before the Holy Father. But they were instructed very strictly, you are not to speak to the Pope. You're just basically to kneel down, he will bless you, and then you go on. So it got to be her turn, and she kneels down in front of the Pope, who at this point, he was like in his late 70s, and he was a pretty frail man. And she grasps his hands, and she starts, "Oh, Holy Father, I want to join Carmel, and I really feel called to this life." And he asks her how old she is, and he says 15, or she says 15. he says, well, you need to be 16, but if it's meant to happen, it will be. And she starts like clinging to the Pope and pleading with him and begging him, so much so that the Swiss guards had to peel her off of him and drag her out of the audience of the Pope. But this must have had an effect on Leo XIII, because about 2 months later, a letter came from the bishop that said her application to Carmel had been accepted. And so she feels like somehow Leo must have contacted the bishop knew of the case, and they worked together to make it happen. So shortly after her 15th birthday, she was admitted to Carmel about in April. And so this was really unusual, but this, like in school where she was kind of picked on by some of the students because they kind of thought she was the teacher's pet, some of the nuns there kind of felt the same way. They're like, well, there's just this kid, so a couple of them were like, we're going to break this one, right? We're gonna make sure, see what she's made out of. And which you wouldn't think that that's how nuns would be, but I guess there's a lot of that goes on. I have a friend of mine who was in religious life for a while. She said you'd be amazed at the amount of personality conflict that goes on in these places. So anyway, so Therese, though, had in the time after she was approved to the time she entered, she had started doing a lot of, she was like starting to serve the poor, and she was starting to do chores around the house she had never done before, and she was starting to just be the servant of others. And then she winds up going into Carmel because she knew this was what the life was like there. And so when she went in there, she realized she was going to have to do this, and she realized too that how small she was compared to the other nuns who had been there for a very long time. And so she there was one story where the nun who was in charge of kind of her training had asked her to clean this one room, like dust it. I don't want to see any dust, is basically what she said. So she gives her this feather duster. And while she's there, she sees there's a spider web in the window, and she's kind of like, ooh, spiders, she kind of leaves it there. But then also she's going along, she sees this broken vase in one of the seats. And as she's examining the broken vase, she's like, well, I'll just kind of put this in my pocket and I'll get rid of it. The nun walks in and sees her getting rid of the parts of this vase. And she's like, Therese, how could you be so careless to break that vase? And Therese knew she didn't break the vase. But she stopped herself and she says, yes, Mother, I'll be more careful. And so she kind of took that on herself to kind of help herself break her own will and her self-love of herself. She had the right to defend herself, but she knew that was not what she should be doing. And so she just took that on. So she wound up doing this more and more. And as one nun, there's this movie that I watched called Therese, which is an outstanding movie. I'll have it up here if you guys want to take a look at what it looks like. But it's not a huge action flick, right? But it's a really good movie, really well done movie that shows you a lot of interpersonal relationships in this family and things like that. It's really well done. If you want to learn about Therese, it's a great movie to do that. But there's a scene where this nun who's in charge of her is showing her how to, they would do this laundry in this pool outside, and she's showing her how to beat the clothes with a stick. And as she's doing it, the water is spraying in Therese's face. And so Therese starts doing it. She's not doing it hard enough, and so the nun shows her again, and Therese gets another face full of water. So then Therese starts doing it and gets the other nun with a face full of water, and she's very apologetic. She didn't mean to do it, but she was taking in all the lessons that she could and trying to do the best job that she could. But she wasn't trying to claim any credit for it. She just wanted to kind of quietly behind the scenes do her work, but to do it well and to do it with love. And so even though it was hard for her, she would offer these things up as a prayer. So if any of you guys have jobs and you're asked to go clean the toilets, right? Nobody wants to clean the toilets, but you can offer that up as a prayer, right? So this is what Therese would do when she would get these really awful jobs that she didn't want to do. She would offer it up for souls, or offer it up for the person that was persecuting her, and do these different types of things. And so she was making her work and the drudgery of her work a prayer. And again, these weren't anything extraordinary other than just doing the things that she had to do in her life, doing them without complaining them, but doing them well and doing them with great love. And so she did this for a number of years, and she did finally make her final vows by the time she was about 17 and a half, and she's just then living the life of a nun, but she's just trying to grow in holiness, but she's just continued to try and empty herself of her pride and of her self-love and just try to be the servant of the others. And over time, the other nuns noticed this to the point where, when she was about 21, 22, one of the mother of the convent said, I want you to write down your biography, tell about your childhood and things like this. And Therese didn't want to do it, but she said, under penalty of disobedience, I need you to do this. And so Therese did it. Because again, she didn't want to bring any attention to herself. She was just, but the mother prioress, she saw something in Therese that she wanted to know more about. And so she began doing this. And that's the beginning part of this book, The Story of a Soul. This is the main thing that Therese wrote. It's just this book. It's not very thick, but she just told about all these difficult things that she grew up with. Again, nothing super extraordinary, right? It just told about some of the challenges in her life, but it showed the development of her from a child who would cry at the drop of a hat to someone who was able to endure more and more suffering. And so she just kind of lived this life of a nun. Again, nothing extraordinary. There was no real big miracles around her, right? There was this miraculous cure. There was one point when she was, before she had entered, in that 3-month period when she was, before she entered the convent, when she just became, she said she had a thirst to save souls. And so she heard about this notorious murderer in town who was going to be executed. She said, he's going to be my first student. And so she never went and saw him, but she just started praying fervently for this man who was going to be executed. And she just did this for like 2 months. And she prayed to God that, I don't need a big sign. I know that you can do anything you want. If there's any way that I can find out, that he converted, that would be wonderful, but I'm not asking you to do that for me. And he was executed, and the papers did report the next day that right before he was executed by guillotine, he asked for a priest and for a crucifix, and he kissed the crucifix 3 times and repented. And the priest told him, he says, the Lord will not abandon you. And so she felt like her prayers had been answered and that this man's soul had been saved. And so this just increased her fervor to save more and more souls. And so this is what you do. The Carmelites, one of their charisms is to pray for priests and to pray for missionaries and things like that. So she would be asked to do this for various priests that were missionaries around the world and things like that. In fact, when she was about 22, they were starting to ask her if she might be willing to go become a missionary, a Carmelite missionary in Indonesia. But at that time, she started developing some symptoms, a really bad cough and things like that, so they held off. And it turns out at that time that she had the advanced signs of tuberculosis, which is a respiratory disease, which basically you start coughing up blood and you just basically drown, you bleed to death in your lungs. And when she realized that this was happening to her, she woke up with a great joy, not because she wanted to die, but she knew that if she died and suffered well, that she would see Jesus. And so she counted this a great joy that she was going to be able to suffer for the Lord. And so she was doing it as quietly as possible. And so by the time she died, she had helped so many of the nuns just in what they were doing. They were just, when they found out, they were just distraught. They, there was a scene in the movie where they're all praying around her deathbed, and even this one nun who could hardly walk comes hobbling in and gets down on her knees and prays for Therese. It's just really touching how this whole convent had gone, had been really unified around this young nun who, when she first got there, many of them didn't even like her. But she had written down so many things in this journal that her older sister Pauline, who was a nun there, took the notes from this and thought, okay, we know Therese has figured out something. We know how she's figured out how to become holy through humility. And so she did a lot of revisions to it and kind of put it in this book called The Story of a Soul. And they thought, well, we'll use this amongst the Carmelites. But it got out into the public and it just spread like wildfire, to the point where when she died in 1897, like I said, if she would have died and this would not have been written down, we never would have heard of her at all. But this book got out, and people realized that there was something special about this nun. And one of the things that she told the sisters, she says, I'm going to spend my eternity on earth with a shower of flowers coming down from heaven. And that's one of the signs sometimes of her miracles, is that people will receive a miraculous rose. They'll be the scent of roses, or they'll be roses in an unexpected place, or something like that. And people sometimes will have these miracles from Saint Therese. And so, so she's someone I would really encourage you to get to know. Like I said, the extraordinariness of her life was that she didn't do anything extraordinary, but she did that really well, and she did it with great humility. So much so that when this got out, it influenced a lot of people, including another now saint, Mother Teresa. Mother Teresa based her entire thing on this, about doing small things with great love. And so if there wouldn't have been for Therese, there might not have been a Mother Teresa, or there may not have been a Mother Teresa who did the things she did the way she did them. So you can see how this has this cumulative effect. And so even in 1910, Pope Pius X, 13 years after her death, opened her cause for canonization. And at that time, you couldn't open the cause until someone had been dead 50 years. And he's like, no, the world needs to know about this. And so by 1925, she was canonized, which in those days was unheard of. And so much so that she had a big influence on Pope John Paul II as well. And he, in 1998, made her a doctor of the church, meaning that her theology is so important that the church would not be the same without it. And so she's one of 3 women who have been doctors of the church. I think now there's 35 doctors of the church. Most of them are like, Augustine and Ambrose, these guys who have volumes of works. John Paul II is now a doctor of the church. Now he has volumes of works. But this is about all she has. But in her way, in here it is described as so simple that it's almost so simple people miss it, because we have such complex lives. We're always looking for different ways to do things. And her way, rather than finding new and more complex ways to do things, was a more simple way. And so this little way really caught on in a lot of ways. And so I would encourage you guys to get to know Therese, because she can bring a lot of peace to you, and realize that we can live our lives quietly. We're all called to holiness, right? There's this universal call to holiness, and she shows that you don't have to do it through great works and great miracles and converting hundreds and thousands of people during your lifetime. You can do it just by doing small things with great love. Do you guys have any questions?